today on the Tearsheet Podcast.
So when people say, okay, well, how is identity likely to progress, digital identity likely to progress? All I say is, look at how payments progressed over the last 20 years, and they'll tell you how identity will progress over the next 5 years. Just compress the time frame because of technology.
The following was produced by Tearsheet Studios. We worked with consulting firm Ulysses Partners to create a 4-part series on identity proofing and the importance of user experience in its emerging landscape. The series is based on our co-created guide, the Identity Proofing Guide, a practical hands-on review of user experience in leading solutions. In this session, I'm joined by David Milligan, Managing Partner at Ulysses Partners, and Ashim Banerjee, Founder and CEO of ID Mission. We'll be talking about the role of identity proofing in financial services at the moment, how an FI can measure success when it comes to identity proofing, and where identity verification fits in the payment space.
So I'm David Milligan, and I head up a boutique consulting firm called Ulysses Partners. We work with mid-sized banks and other financial institutions and well-established fintechs around the world to help them work together for digital transformation. I've been working with fintech firms and in the banking space for over 20 years and have worked with literally hundreds of financial service organizations and thousands of fintechs around the world. And very excited to be here today to talk about identity.
Welcome. And Ashim, can you talk about who you are and what you do?
Yeah, my name is Ashim Banerjee. I'm the founder and CEO of ID Mission. And before ID Mission, I was part of a fintech startup that was acquired by TSYS. So I've been in payments for many, many years. And for the last few years, we've sort of tried to look at the convergence of payments and identity.
So in our last conversation, we talked about identity proofing in general and some of the trade-offs between identity proofing and user experience. I'd love to hear what the role of identity proofing in financial services is right now. Can you give us a lay of the land?
So I think let me just start off by saying that identity proofing is critical, as we've talked about in a previous session. It's most important to be able to prove who we say we are during the payments process. And I think that in financial services, what we've observed is that with the incredible growth of uptake in digital channels, particularly spurred in the US by the pandemic and other markets, is we've seen incredibly rapid adoptions of digital onboarding, forced really by circumstances, by financial institutions, particularly in the US. And in the course of doing that, what we saw was a rampant uptake in fraud. Research that we've looked at from other providers includes things like nearly 40% of US consumers in 2020 reported experiencing some sort of identity fraud, identity theft. So the reason that's happening is identity proofing hasn't been addressed in a very robust way, and in some cases. And so also what we've seen is that, in the rush to get something in place, the identity proofing solutions that have been chosen have not always been the ones that are using the newest technologies and providing the best user experience. So we think that, identity proofing is critical. And we also believe that the use of biometrics in identity proofing is really the gold standard, document-based identity verification. And in the survey that we did of solutions across the market, and we chose the top 6 that we found, including ones using the newest technologies, we found that the user experience of doing identity proofing has evolved so much that, in fact, organizations need to look at this again and be sure that they're using the best solutions. And in fact, ID Mission, in our recent survey and our research and evaluation, came up as the top ranked solution in terms of user experience, which is really why Ashim is with us here today.
Yeah, thank you, David. I'll just add that identity itself is something that needs to be established not just at the time of account opening or onboarding, but all through the customer's life cycle, right? The customer has a life cycle, and similarly at each touch point in that life cycle, identity needs to be established. So certainly during account opening. But then what about when I'm transacting, right? So today I have to use login and password or something like that on a website or on a mobile device,
Mm.
why not just use my selfie that I submitted at the time of account opening? When I call in for help, they ask me, what city did you live in 1998 and all that kind of stuff. Wouldn't it be much better to just take a voice sample and authenticate me using my voice? So this sort of idea that the experience over the life cycle is fragmented and that can be easily unified using the same biometrics that you collected at the time of ID proofing really makes the experience significantly better.
Yeah.
While at the same time making security better as well.
Yeah, in fact, just building on that a little bit, there's been a little bit of sort of debate, I think, recently in the public sphere around biometrics and the use of biometrics, particularly when it comes to accessing government services. And I think it's very important for us to understand that using biometrics, firstly, isn't a new phenomenon. You could argue that, in fact, the same way that a bank sort of collects someone's signature in the previous, when people are using checks and signature cards, a signature is really a crude form of biometric. And it's something that you're checking against in case of need. Now, what's happening is, our need to check and verify the identity of people at different points is becoming greater and greater as we have more fraud, more bad actors. It's just become much more complex. And so in that complex space, we need to use the very best technology and approaches to proving someone's identity at the time that they sign up for a service and to be able to verify their identity at the time that they authenticate. And it's really important not to, the English have a phrase, throw out the baby with the bathwater, where you're saying, don't let debate around how governments may use biometrics obscure the fact that, as individuals, we have a right to be able to go to an organization, sign up for their services, and have them take the best possible steps to protect us when using their services. And similarly, when we no longer use their services, we should have the right, for that to be forgotten, as they say in European markets. But in the old analogy, when we close our bank account, the bank should tear up our signature card. That's and the same kind of things can be used today. Anyway, we'll talk more about that as we go along.
So I have a curiosity. I'm curious around how you guys would recommend a financial institution to measure the success when it comes to identity proofing, maybe to also help us understand what the trade-offs are.
Yeah, I think in the previous talk, Ruby Walia talked about this extensively. And the idea is that the user experience is what ends up in creating metrics that are of value to the bank, right? The whole idea of using a sign-up process is that you should be able to get more and more people to sign up easily, conveniently, and securely, right? So using the right digital identity proofing processes and using them in a way that they're integrated seamlessly with the rest of your onboarding process will result in larger numbers of people signing up in shorter amounts of time, larger numbers of people saying that they enjoyed doing it rather than having to fill up lots of forms by hand and things like that, and fewer number of people abandoning the process halfway through. So all of these are actually direct metrics into what the banks or what the financial institutions or what the consumers of digital identity are looking for.
I think just, again, building on that, what we've seen is that, the people, financially should focus on metrics like, what is the false positive rate or the false negative rate, which we've all become much more familiar with than we used to be, thanks to, COVID testing. But in fact, that perhaps is no longer the right measure for financial institutions to go solely. It's absolutely a component, but there are actually more nuanced approaches to this. So it's not about getting the most accurate model. It's about saying, well, what are you trying to achieve here? What is this particular transaction about? And depending on the nature of the transaction, what you're trying to achieve determines which metrics actually matter most. I know, Ashim, you have some sort of high-level thoughts on that.
Yeah, these days, when you talk about identity and identity proofing, a lot of companies are using newer technologies such as machine learning and artificial intelligence. So the question really becomes, how do I know the performance I should expect from my machine learning models, for example? And accuracy is really often considered as the sort of benchmark, but accuracy is actually the least useful model depending on your use case, right? So if you're trying to prevent fraud, in other words, a false positive is something that you're really interested in, then there is a different measure of how the model performs with respect to false positives, which is called precision. I mean, how well does your model behave in being able to reduce false positives? If false negatives are of great importance, then there's a different metric altogether, which is called recall. So, I mean, there's a little bit of jargon here, but the point is that accuracy in itself gives you a small part of the picture. And there are other metrics created by machine learning, by data scientists, to be able to tell you what part or how the model will perform for your business case. So I think it's important that consumers, that business people, etc., try to spend a little bit of time understanding the different metrics that become relevant in machine learning before they decide on which model is likely to work for them.
I appreciate that distinction. I want to drill down further into payments and talk about how identity verification is situated in the payment space, and within the sort of various niche payments.
So, I mean, ultimately, identity matters most in different contexts, like Ashim was talking about, and it's payments is, one of those moments of truth. So if you think about, again, the world of payments, as things have evolved, so we went from having checks, writing out the check, checking the signature on the check, then look at the world of credit cards, which started similarly with, while we're signing, and here in the United States, they're still apparently checking a signature. But in other parts of the world, they moved on to things like using a PIN, entering this. So that gets into, if you step back very quickly, identity verification triad, if you like, is about, there's knowledge based, something the password that you've typed in, the PIN, something that you have, which is like a fob, a keychain, or most commonly we have our mobile phone and we receive some sort of a text code that comes back. So that's proving you have that object. And then ultimately there's the something you are, which is the biometric piece of it. Now, in the same way, that evolution of asserting your identity at time of payments in the online world, now when we're making a credit card payment online, people are typing in that CVV, which is again trying to say it's something I have. But in fact, you can know that number and not have the card. So as we found that we needed better and more secure ways to prove our identities and assert our identity, so new technologies are coming into place. And we think that in the world of identity and payments, the latest sort of thing is to say, well, what are the other parallels? How else are we asserting identity in payments that we can use in the world of identity? And Ashim, I know you have some thoughts on that.
Yeah. So as I said in my introduction, my experience is kind of the overlap of payments and identity. I used to be part of a large payment company that acquired a previous startup I was with, and now we are focused on identity. And it's only natural to say that, okay, identity today, we think of it, identity is the oldest thing, right? I mean, ever since Adam and Eve, they were able to look at each other and identify each other. So it's really the oldest thing around. But modern uses of identity are interesting. So when people say, okay, well, how is identity likely to progress, digital identity likely to progress? All I say is, look at how payments progressed over the last 20 years, and they'll tell you how identity will progress over the next 5 years, just compress the time frame because of technology, right? So how has payments progressed? Payments has progressed from exchanging physical tokens as guarantors of payment, either as cash, check, etc., to card-based payments, and then to the idea of a tokenized payment where the card number, because of security reasons, is never actually exchanged, only a token is exchanged. And one can easily see identity progressing in exactly the same way. In fact, I would go so far as to say it's likely that your face or your biometric becomes a token, not just of your identity, but also of your payment, right? It's not hard to imagine that if you walk up to a Safeway or a Whole Foods or whatever, And instead of tapping your card to complete the payment, there's a tablet there. The camera recognizes you. The payment device is hidden behind your face, and the payment just happens as you walk through. We are actually doing this today with several customers who are trying to create this experience, right? The user experience of magic, and that's what it all boils down to, right? So imagine you are at I don't know, a Boston Celtics game or something, and during the halftime you go off to get yourself a drink, and instead of having standing line, you go to a bar which is completely self-service. As you walk up there, the camera recognizes you and allows you to pick your mixed drink, pours your drink, and you walk away. And this is exactly a good company that we are working with called Tended Bar that is doing exactly this experience. So I think that is where we expect to see more and more of the magic happening, with the magic being possible because of identity being established through a biometric.
And I mean, I'd also, though, want to add to that, to say that, so people have, maybe like sensitive to this idea of a biometric, but you need to think about it clearly in saying that, as long as we communicate properly around this, and that there are established rules. I mentioned earlier this idea of, if you close your bank account, the bank needs to close your account and get rid of your signature card. The same kind of transparency needs to be applied as this industry evolves. In other words, right now, we are signing up with services. They are proving our identity in the best way possible by saying, here's my government issued ID, whatever it is, passport, driver's license, and this is my selfie, and matching these two. And it's really important that that information can be used to create these magical experiences. But the idea of using your biometric to prove your identity at the moment where you want it. It's like, entering in your details or making a payment to an Uber, and you step out of the Uber, you've pre-authorized that to happen. And if you no longer want to use Uber, you can remove your authority to do that. And so, that's how biometrics should be working. And people often sort of confuse biometrics at the point of getting a service with passive facial recognition, which is the domain of governments. That's what it must not be. We need to make sure that the industry communicates as a whole around how can we use biometrics in the most transparent and clear way, and that people have a right to have their biometric information removed. So it must be, service provider by service provider.
Well, I'm going to take with me the magic of identity proofing and the magic of payments when it's done right. David, Ashim, thank you very much for joining us today. This was David Milligan and Ashim Banerjee in conversation about where identity proofing is situated in financial services today, and how an FI can measure their success in this parameter. This is part 2 of a 4-part series we've created with Ulysses Partners on identity proofing. To read the transcript of the conversation and download the full identity proofing guide, head on over to the Tearsheet website.